so excited hearing that reading. I don't know if anyone else has read that book, Octavia's Brood, but this idea, this notion that these stories in our imagination can be seeds for change, and not just something to entertain ourselves with, has been a guiding source of energy for the past couple of years, and what I'm excited to speak to you about this morning. On this morning, this day, in this state that feels so vital and alive right now, and so poised for change. I will admit that these past several months have felt dire to me. As a person who was born and raised here, a state where my mother has roots that are generations deep. As the spring months approached, I found myself feeling unwelcome in my own home, in my own city, in my own state, and it was painful. I felt like things were going unchecked. Laws were passed and proposed and passed right and left, and nothing was going to stop it. And it was threatening people that I love so dearly, and it was threatening to cut deeper. They were trying to do all that they could, these people in power, to make Tennessee an unwelcome place for what I believe to be the bravest of our neighbors, our trans and gender nonconforming siblings and cousins who wake up every day and choose freedom, who choose themselves. I felt both convicted and overwhelmed, wanting to offer solace and protection to those who most needed it, and also to be on the offense for my own family. But contradicting all of that, I felt a need to escape, to care for myself, even to distract. And when I need to distract, going back to the subject of story, my first and most beloved action has always been to open a book. My entire life, I've been an avid reader. I was raised to be this. My father is an avid reader of everything from history books to science fiction, and he instilled in my sisters and me a passion for stories, for books. The family legend is that Dad would never say no to buying a book, like ever, and we took very, very sincere advantage of that. And I do the same thing now to our girls who can't even read yet, but you know. For a time, my bedtime story was a chapter a night of The Hobbit. Like, that's how deep this love of story and fantasy was in our house. And I loved stories that painted a picture of a world that didn't exist or a world that could be. One beloved middle grade novel I loved was called This Place Has No Atmosphere. It told the story of a teenager whose family decided to relocate to a new colony on the moon, where, of course, she faced all the same struggles that teenagers experienced here on Earth, but at least she was on the moon. I was one of those kids who thought they were getting away with something when I was reading a book under the covers with a flashlight, but as a parent now, I'm almost certain my parents knew I was doing that and were delighted in the practice. Books were an escape, a refuge, a place to find freedom, and for my imagination to run wild. I often spent non-reading time daydreaming about inserting myself into those plot lines, thrilled at the notion of solving big problems or stepping out of my world and into another. I spent Saturday mornings planted not in front of cartoons, but in front of episodes of Star Trek: The Next Generation and Deep Space Nine, just as good. I obsessed over movies like The Never-Ending Story and The Last Unicorn. My fellow Gen Xers and older millennials hopefully know what I'm talking about. Space Camp was another big movie that I loved. All of these stories were either not of this world or gave the cast of characters an opportunity to leave this one, to get out into space. When I dig back into my memory and survey my favorites, a pattern very quickly emerges. I had volume after volume of the Boxcar Children series, that beloved stories around a set of siblings who are orphaned and set up house in a boxcar. At the end of the first book, they begin to live with their grandfather, but the following books in the series somehow always centered around them heading into someplace new and setting up house again, gathering provisions and making sure the family had everything they needed as they set out to solve mysteries from some new location. I also loved the book From the Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Basil E. Frankweiler, where two siblings ran away and lived in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So clearly a theme. At first glance, that theme was escape, right? I remember being very clearly what truly excited me about the stories, though. Like, I was intrigued and excited about the notion of forging out on my own, or rather of landing in some new circumstance and gathering everything I needed to make my way in this new world, figuring out how to adapt and set up a new way of life. I found these challenges exciting, and when I put my books down, I kept up this project in my own imagination, a place where I was capable, ingenuitive, and independent. As I grew older, I found myself deeply enjoying what I referred to then as dystopian novels that told the story of the world after something had gone gravely wrong and of the people who were struggling to survive but also somehow building something new. Now, about 8 years or so ago, when the political tide in this country, to me, felt like it was turning to a dark place, and when those in power started using rhetoric that I found frightening, I made a lot of jokes about how I was just kidding about loving a dystopia. Like, never mind. Because the world had started taking a shape that I never thought I would see. And while I had faith, it became harder and harder to see how the arc of history was truly bending towards justice. On Star Trek: The Next Generation, the ship's calm and collected Captain Picard often checked in with his crew after any sort of battle or attack by shouting, "Damage report," in order to get a readout of any harm the ship or its crew had sustained. For the past several months, maybe years, but really these past several months, I felt a similar need to cry out "damage report" every time I checked the news or social media. There always seemed to be some sort of fresh hell to find, whether it was restrictions on teachers, banned books, harmful and frightening laws that restrict or strip the rights of people that I love, or more recently, horrible violence in our own community, or the expulsion of two of the few lawmakers in the state who share my values. The world around me started to feel like so much good was ending, and the stress was all-consuming. So, and you can check with Ashley on this, lately, my nose has been very deep back into books. Also, during the first few years of the pandemic, after a period where I can only consume books and other media that were overwhelmingly positive and joy-filled, right? Like everything was so hard and difficult, I didn't want to read anything scary. Like I was really into Schitt's Creek and Parks and Recreation, just like fill my heart up. I also started turning to science fiction more and more directly as an escape. And now, through reading books by Adrienne Maree Brown, I also had started to think of the terms speculative fiction and visionary fiction. This is fiction that's imagining the world as it could be. So it was then, at some point in 2020, when I finally picked up Octavia Butler's work, Parable of the Sower. This book could certainly be labeled dystopian fiction, but it is so much more than that. I'm going to borrow again quickly from Octavia's Brood, the book where we found our reading, to give you a brief description of Parable of the Sower if you haven't read it. Butler's book, Parable of the Sower, follows the main character, Olamina, a young black woman who lives in a slightly dystopic future in a gated community. She carries a radically different vision for the purpose of humanity than her Christian family. She believes our destiny is to take root among the stars, to see Earth as a womb rather than a permanent home. She calls her beliefs Earth Seed, and she cultivates Earth Seed as she matures in the tiny and dangerous container of her home. The central tenet of Olamina's Earth Seed is, all that you touch, you change. All that you change, changes you. The only lasting truth is change. Beloveds, I don't know how many of you have ever read a book that changed your life. Given the crowd, I'm sure that many of you have, as I am among friends. Parable of the Sower is one of those books for me. And the tenets of Earth Seed, all that you touch, you change. All that you change, changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. Wove itself into the fabric of my personal theology. And just as powerful as that concept, reading Butler's work alongside Brown's and other scholarship around her work taught me to start viewing these stories as more than stories. They were workbooks. We know our imagination is a powerful tool. It is a source of deep play and can even be a saving grace as it can allow us to escape during times of stress or even trauma. But how many of us have had the experience of pausing and realizing that the writers who do the work of envisioning what another world could look like are doing more than telling stories? They are building paths towards justice. We don't often spend enough time illustrating and reveling in the beauty of the world we're trying to build. Instead, we're mired in the problem itself, in the despair we feel, in the overwhelm that comes with trying to penetrate the systems that hold the problem firmly in place. All of this makes sense, but we need to find a way out of the stuck place. This is where visionary fiction comes in, or if not fiction, a practice of our own visionary imagination. Author Toni Cade Bambara said, "We must make just and liberated futures irresistible." These words light a small fire in me because they help me realize that even in my own overwhelm, the lifetime practice that I've kept of storytelling, imagining, and meaning-making is actually a tool set that I can employ in the work of collective liberation. In order to inspire myself and others to dig in and do the work to right wrongs, to create beloved community, or to do our part to meet the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. Maybe this is some of what I can do to illustrate and bring to life the world we dream about. To again quote Adrienne Maree Brown, can you tell where I get my inspiration from? She said, "Justice, rights, and things are things we take for granted. They are not permanent. Once there were kings and queens all over the earth. Someday we may speak of presidents and CEOs as past tense only." How awesome, how helpful, and how medicinal is the imagination? How powerful. Someone used theirs to build the systems we have now. We can use ours to discover how to build the next one. Visionary fiction, science fiction, speculative fiction, all of these genres can be sacred text. Creating them can be a sacred exercise. The act of imagining the world we deserve is not only a centering exercise, but a justice-making act. Artist Molly Costello wrote, as an introduction to her collection of work, Fertile Futures, "There is so much extracted from each of us. What would it look like for us to slow down and sow care and nutrients into our shared foundations? What are shared values that support wellness and abundance in our social spaces?" She goes on to say, "I trust each of our imaginations with these questions, and I know that I am certainly not the only one holding them. I trust that each of us is doing our part and that our small practices will slowly connect in new webs of being. We will shift our culture toward the sacred truth that each of our lives are interconnected and hold value as we create the world that reflects us." As you leave here today, I encourage you to nurture your imaginations. Read Octavia Butler. Watch Star Trek. Watch The Twilight Zone. Read Ursula K. Le Guin and N.K. Jemisin. Daydream as you lay in bed tonight about what the future could look like. Pick up your pen and take notes on how the world could be. Engage in conversation with your community about what you have read and what you have dreamed. And then start living as if you are there. Start demanding of the people in power that they take steps in the right direction. Show up to protests, tomorrow Monday, to worship on Sunday, inspired and strong, ready to build. Activist and visionary Grace Lee Boggs said, "Another world is possible. Another world is necessary. Another world is happening, and the only way for us to survive is by taking care of each other." May we remain hopeful. May we remember that we are powerful and that our choices matter. May we find enough opportunity to rest so that we have the energy to imagine. And may we share that vision with others. This is our life's work. This is the future we leave our children. This is the world that lies in wait. This is our work. It is holy work, and we are just the people to do it. May it be so.